Welcome to Loving My Lower Back series. In this awareness video, I'm going to go through with you a number of props and alternatives that you have. You can take a few notes if you need to, and then you can modify your practice along the way. It might be for general classes or any of the other classes online that you could modify so it suits your needs with any lower back conditions you might have. There's a number of possibilities and causes for lower back conditions. And I've worked my way through a number myself with chronic lordosis, scoliosis, spondylolistheses, and also sacroiliac joint dysfunction. If you are in acute pain, I do suggest you have a diagnosis of your condition. So perhaps if you haven't already seen a physiotherapist, a chiropractor, osteopath, exercise physiologist, someone who can help you diagnose what your needs are so we can modify your practice around those needs. And please feel free to contact me before you start a practice on your own if you are in acute pain. So the following Loving My Lower Back series are practices designed for maintenance of general lower back conditions by strengthening core and helping to create balance between the external abdominal muscles and the spinal muscles, lower back muscles, balance and flexibility of the hip flexors and the glutes, the quadriceps and the hamstrings. So helpful in improving postural alignment, pelvic alignment, but also the way we use our feet, because how we use our feet designs the rest of the joints all the way up into the hips and the angle of the pelvis and the lower back. So it does start from the feet up. So these practices will focus on posture and core in particular. So you might like to have someone take a photo of you side on, seated and standing, and maybe have a look for yourself what your posture looks like, or maybe even you can send that in to me by email if you want a little bit of help diagnosing. So two very opposing postural habits that we might have is that from side on, if you are tucking the tail under and tipping the pelvis backwards, a posterior pelvic tilt, you would be pulling the pubic bone forward, compressing the internal organs of the front body, but lengthening out and perhaps weakening these lower back muscles. It could be caused or could have inclusive of glute tightness, hamstring tightness, maybe quad weakness, hip flexor weakness to have that posterior tilt happening. So we need to strengthen and create a little bit more tone in those lower back muscles so you have a little bit more of a natural curve and support in the lumbar so we can activate core more efficiently. But we may also need to strengthen quads and hip flexors, lengthen glutes and hamstrings so we can create that balance in posture. Or you could be the opposite where you tilt the pelvis too far forward, stick the tail out behind, and you create compression in the lower back, so a shortening and tightening of these lower back muscles, a weakening and lengthening of the abdominals, a short, tight hip flexor and perhaps a weaker glute, tighter quadriceps and perhaps weaker hamstrings. So we need to work on lengthening these quadriceps and hip flexors, toning the belly muscles so we can create more length through the tail, a little bit more length in these lumbar muscles, more tone in the glutes and the hamstrings. And then we can create an improved posture so we can activate core more efficiently. So the following series are designed to create an all-round balance of toning, lengthening, and activating of core of all these muscles that I have just mentioned. But you might find knowing your particular postural habit will help you hone in on the body parts that you know you need to. And of real importance is to find out where your sit bones are, because I'm going to be talking about them a lot. So if you're not aware of those two little bony bits in your buttocks, I'm going to get you to bring your legs out in front, sit onto your hands, and then just have a little wiggle and feel those little bony bits in your buttocks that when you're sitting up straight, they're pointing straight down. When you tuck your tail under, they're scooping in and pointing towards the inside of your feet. When you're tipping the pelvis forward, you're sticking your tail out behind and they're spreading wide into the hands. So as long as you have an awareness of where those sit bones are, as we make our way through this series, you'll be able to correct posture, but also create a little more toning through pelvic floor and deep core muscles, because of the movement and placement of these sit bones governs the posture. So I do recommend that you watch the core setup 1, 2, and 3. So you have got a good understanding of moving from the sit bones, especially in the functional pelvic patterns, but also watching the core series 1 and 2. So they're a nice gentle way of activating core, but also starting to create a little bit more challenge. They may be a little too strong if you are in acute pain, so you may prefer to stick to just this lower back loving series number 1 until you're past that stage of acute pain. So starting off with finding a comfortable seat when you have got lower back conditions. So there are the Asana Addict series, Sukhasana, which is your cross-legged, and Virasana is your kneeling position. If in Sukhasana cross-legged, you find that you have got a little bit of that backward posterior tilt of the pelvis and your pubic bones pulling forward, your back's dragging down, the tail's tucking under, I would prefer you had something like a block underneath the pelvis, or even a little bit higher. If you're quite tight in the hips, you might need a little bit more height. More angle of the thigh bones helps to create that natural forward tilt of the pelvis. And that way, especially when it's something firm like a block, you can find those sit bones and start to move them wider apart so they're not tucking under with your tail and you're sitting up onto a broad sit bone base. And that'll help to create that little bit more tone in the lower back. But then if you are a little bit more like me, where you've got quite a deep lordosis, a deep curve in the lower back, you might even also be flaring the front ribs and really stretching out that belly. Maybe it's just for you to have a blanket underneath the buttock, or even sitting on the floor, where you get to release the lower back a little bit more and let those lower ribs drop in. And if there are any other positions seated that you're just not finding comfortable, going through that Asana Addict series so you can find what's comfortable for you. So you'll find in series 1, I go through cat-cow, which is a really great way of creating tone through core, lower back, and lower belly. It's a nice safe option for lower back if there is some acute condition. You have a few options with child pose where, depending if you have a backward tilt or too much forward tilt in your pelvis, there's 2 options you might prefer to use with child pose. If you tend to have your tail tucking under too much, having your thighs together for child pose will create even more rounding of the lower back when you fold forward. So that's even more lengthening of the lumbar. And we want to try and avoid that position because we want to try and create a little bit more tone in the lower back. So you might be better having your knees a little bit wider for child. Maybe you're going to put a bolster in between the legs. And as you fold forward, you got less of that rounding through your lower back. Maybe something under the forehead, maybe a block. However, if you are more of a forward tilter in your pelvis, a lot of compression through the lower back, having thighs together is best for you with lower back. You might even have something piled up on your thighs to give you more rounding, like a blanket, where you fold forward and you create more of that lengthening of those lower back muscles that are a little bit tight and compressed. If you were to do your wide knee child pose, I think you'll find that you're creating still that little bit of tone and compression in the lower back with the knees wide. So child pose, knees together might be the best option for you. And then we also have laying prone can be an uncomfortable position for lower back. So perhaps having a folded blanket, or even if there is any disc issues with lower back, having maybe a nice soft pillow underneath the hip bones and even up towards the lower ribs if you've got that real compression through the lumbar. blanket or pillow underneath the front of the hips whenever you lay prone, so that you've just got that little bit more lengthening of the lower back and you're creating that little bit more space in the lumbar when you lay face down. And that could make it a lot gentler when you're doing anything, laying face down, even any back extension work could be a lot more comfortable if you've got that cushioning under the hip bones and maybe even right up to the lower ribs. So if you have got over-lengthened lower back muscles and you're prone to that little bit of a tucking back, tilting back of the pelvis, any forward bends, whether they're seated or standing, not doing them with straight legs. So you're going to want to do them with bent knees, and then you've given your hamstrings that little bit more length to open up so you can fold forward with the pelvis. Rather than having straight legs, the sit bones get locked and a fold forward just becomes a rounding of your lower back, which means those lower back muscles that are already lengthened, unsupported, are getting even more of a stretch. So you may even find a folded blanket or two underneath the sit bones, maybe even a bolster if you've got really tight hamstrings, and that little bend in the knees, so that when you fold forward, you can start off with those sit bones wide because they're going to go even wider as you tip forward, but focusing on leading with your heart. So as you start to fold forward, it doesn't matter how far forward you're coming, as long as it's about those sit bones moving back and spreading apart and your pelvis rolling forward, not so much your whole back rounding into that shape. That might be the perfect hamstring stretch for you. And if you were doing this from a standing position, you would have that little bend in the knees. You might even place a block in between the thighs to give you a little bit more pelvic floor and lower belly support in the core. So with that bend in the knees, you could start to spread the sit bones and maybe hands or forearms rest on the thighs. And you're getting a hamstring lengthening from there as you try to stick the tail up, rather than having locked out knees and folding forward with that flexed back where you're already a little unsupported. So it's more about bent knees, sit bone spreading, belly rolling towards the thighs. Maybe hands are going to rest on the thighs. And maybe you're going to use that block in between your thighs to give it a squeeze and use a little bit of pelvic floor to support lower back. And another one to be mindful of with lower back is adding levers to your posture. So for example, if you're folding forward and then you were to raise your arms up as you fold forward, you're adding a long load onto that lower back as you come forward. So if you've got any lower back conditions, I would suggest you have your hands to heart center or hands on hips, or arms are out wide rather than extended out where you're putting that extra load on the lower back. So you might be folding forward with hands to heart, hands on thighs. And then one of the safest ways to come up is with your knees bent, hands on thighs, and then you're drawing in through the belly, walking your hands up your thighs, using your arm strength to support the lower back as you come upright. So there's no strain on the lumbar with the torso peeling up on its own, bit of support with your hands. And the same goes for your forward folds with extending those arms in a seated position, that if you were to raise your arms up and then fold forward, you've added all that length and load to your lower back. So much better off having a bit more of a stable base with your hands on the floor or your thighs as you fold forward, or maybe they're around a strap or a TheraBand, but try not to pull, so you're getting that pulling action on your lower back. It's more about those sit bones widening, heart lifting and opening, and that folding forward from your pelvis, deepening those hip creases. Maybe there's more bend in the knees. And the same goes with the arms being long levers as your legs being levers, that you may need to resist the temptation of adding long legs to abdominal work, where when you're laying on your back and any abdominal work where you might be raising one leg at a time, the supporting foot on the floor is protecting the lower back. Once you raise both feet off the floor and you work into a little bit more of that hover position, you haven't got that supporting foot on the floor protecting your lower back. So you might need to stay at that level where a grounded foot stays on the floor and you swap from one side to the other. Much gentler on lower back. But also if you're doing anything with your legs where you might be taking the heel towards the floor, as soon as you make your legs straight, you've made more distance from your hip to your toes and you've loaded into that lower back and core area. So keeping the knees bent with any of your abdominal work will help to lessen the load on the lower back. So while you're in those initial stages of any lower back discomfort or rehabilitation, knees always stay bent, no straight legs, no big extending long arms. Just being mindful of those levers. And then last one you might need to be aware of is if you have got any disc herniation where the disc in most cases is pushing out to one side of the vertebrae of the spinal process. So any lateral movement where you might be tipping to the sides, on one side you might be compressing where the disc is. If you tip the other way, you might be opening up and pushing the bulge open to that side that it's bulging out. So you might need to avoid any lateral torso stretches or deep twists seated when you have got any bulges happening through the lumbar discs. So you're much better off doing any twists laying on your back where you have, perhaps you have ankles and knees together, and you might even find a bit of support against the outside of the legs with a bolster. So it's a much gentler twist than if you were to lift the legs up or even have the legs crossed, or you might even have foot on knee. So if any of those positions feel a little bit too much for the lumbar, ankles and knees together, bit of support against the outside of the thighs is going to be much gentler on the lower back for twist, and definitely a better option than doing twists seated, which can be quite compressing on the lumbar vertebrae and discs. Okay, so thanks for joining me in a little understanding of what sort of options you have got with working with lower back, and please do contact me if anything comes up for you where you're not quite sure how you could modify for your situation with your lower back. And have a little read of the description on this video for any suggestion of other classes that may not be under the lower back series, but they may be really good options for you to work with. And I look forward to working with you online. Namaste.